Okay, hi everyone. Thank you for joining me. I am Amy Scheidegger, the founder and director of Rock and Roar Creative, and I do graphic design and illustration. But for 2021, I wanted to collaborate with a different person every month, just in a way to reconnect with people that I've lost touch with during this COVID pandemic. But this person sitting next to me, I have not disconnected with. You are my husband.
Yes, I am.
And this just seemed to be my husband, who is Dr. Pedro Ducos. You hate it when people call you doctor?
A little bit.
In this time of a global pandemic, I just thought it was really relevant to talk to a scientist about ways in which the science industry has dealt with this pandemic. So, once again, Dr. Pedro Ducos, he is a physicist at the Universidad de San Francisco de Quito, which is where we are. We live in Quito, Ecuador. We are, if you have questions about where we are in our basement / Pedro's office. This is a mural I created for the office. It is a quote by Richard Feynman, your favorite physicist.
Yes.
You want to talk about why he's your favorite?
He just always seemed interested in really understanding what he was doing. And he was very good at sharing what he learned as well. I feel a lot of physicists have trouble communicating what they know, and they are experts in their field, and they're remarkable professionals, but they have hard time giving that knowledge or sharing that knowledge outside of a paper scenario, right? It's more of a colloquial conversation or in a classroom. But Richard Feynman was a very extroverted scientist, which sort of defies what traditionally most scientists are thought of. Mm-hmm. And because of this, in part, he was very, very communicative and very good at explaining what he knew. So I admired him certainly as a scientist. He's a Nobel Prize winner. But also as well, I admired him as a teacher, as a communicator, which both things I strive to be. And this is my favorite quote of him.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can attest. He has described a lot of scientific things to me that were easier to understand because it goes right over my head. So I guess that sort of leads us into him being a really good communicator. So I guess my question is, where did your motivation to become a scientist, and specifically a physicist, where did that come from?
So I was always very, very curious. Since I was a kid, I would like to disassemble things just because I wanted to know how things worked on the inside. And when I was very small, I actually wanted to be an engineer because that's what I thought science was. However, as I grew up and I went through high school and the very beginnings of college, I definitely realized that engineering is much more of an applied scientific endeavor. But if you really want to get to disassemble things, pure science is where you want to be. And out of all the pure sciences, physics was always the one that sort of attracted me the most. So I decided to start a career in physics. But yeah, it was just a curiosity that needed to be quenched in some way.
So, like, going back to this quote, like, nearly everything is really interesting the deeper you go into it. So engineering just didn't go as far as, like, you really wanted to go?
Yes, exactly. Mm-hmm. Like, you can start thinking of, like, how things work, and you get to engineering, but then there are certain things that engineering just doesn't quite cover. If you want to keep going deeper, I feel physics in particular is very, like, its whole point is to just get deeper. And when you find an answer to something, you still want to get deeper. Mm-hmm. Like, there's always something that you can keep
just digging
out of. Yeah. And that's sort of why I ended up in physics. It's it's how I could quench that curiosity that I always had since I was a kid.
You're sitting here talking to an artist. You married an artist. Your mom is actually an artist as well. How do you think science and art interact?
I do feel it's very particular. I think to summarize it, and I'll go into it a little bit more in detail, but to summarize it, I think they're both very creative endeavors. I do feel like this, in traditional universities, these was recognized very early on, which is why in most universities, engineering is its own faculty, and arts and sciences are their own faculty, and they're together. Because engineering, they recognize it's a different endeavor than pure science. And pure science, it's just very creative process. So in that sense, I think that's where the similarities lie. Here in Latin America, they tend to bundle science and engineering together and art separately. However, I do think that they just both require a lot of creativity and just working on that creativity to get to the results you want.
Yeah, I also think so. Science, or at least physics in particular, is all about seeing figuring out how the world works, and I think art is all about figuring out how people work. There's a lot of psychology, and a lot of artwork is about what the artist is feeling at that moment, or reflecting humanity. So yeah, it's like how the world works, how people work, and it all sort of combines.
Yeah, and I think art also can reflect on how the world works.
Yeah.
I just think we're looking at the same things, whether that's people, because when I say science, I don't specifically mean physics, right? Like we can look at how the brain works, right? Or stuff like that. So we definitely look at people and places, both arts and sciences. I just think we look at it through different tools. I do feel both endeavors are very creative. I do think art looks at it from a sort of subjective perspective, and science tries to look at it from an objective perspective.
Factual.
Like I feel arts try to solve the same, or try to look at the same things, just subjectively on how it affects the artist. And then science tries to look at the same things, but tries to extract the scientist out of the science and try to find what is the most objective truth. So I think we look at the same things through different tools. And I also think that's why it turns to attract the same kind of people in a way. If you look at and not everyone is in either field is like this, but if you look at the stereotype artists and the stereotype scientists, they tend to be similar people, right? They tend to be people who just get very into their work. And even there's the stereotype of maybe they're very very introverted, and because they just work in their thing so much, because they can't so they even, and like I said, Richard Feynman defied in the terms of science what the stereotype is like. But I do feel it attracts the same kind of people, right? It's just the outlook that we take on the same things. It's through different tools, even though we're looking at the same things. And that's where I think the relationship
and that leads me to something we've talked about before, is this idea of genius, right? Like a lot of people who are physicists won Nobel Prizes, they're considered genius. There's a lot of artistic genius, tortured genius. And I feel like both of us have this, no, we're not genius. We just work really, really, really hard at what we do. And science, nothing comes easy. Yeah. Per se. Yeah, it's just a lot.
And I do think there's geniuses in either side, on both sides, right? I do feel the perception somewhat is that if you're a genius, it just comes easy to you, and that's where I think the difference is. Just because you're really good naturally at what you do doesn't mean you don't have to work at it at the same time.
Right.
So I think that's when we talk about that, sort of where we sort of stand. Even though you might be a genius, you still have to work very hard, because they're both very difficult things to get good at. Even if you're naturally predisposed for it.
Okay, so I'm going to move to, current events, sort of what's happening in the world today. We've been in this COVID lockdown for about a year at this point. Something that people of our age have never seen, or I guess anybody living right now hasn't really seen this. How do you think, you as a scientist, you as somebody who wants to know how things are working on an intimate basis, how has living through a pandemic for the past year sort of affected?
Well, me personally, I'm an experimentalist, right? So I need very expensive equipment that need to be operated by hand, right? Like there's people who work in labs that are so expensive that you can operate the equipment remotely. However, that's not my lab.
Right.
So essentially, this has limited my ability to do research to basically almost zero. And we're writing a paper right now, so there's things I can do towards research with data that we already had. But my ability to get new data has been just completely
shut down.
Right. So it definitely limits the amount of work I can do as a scientist. Obviously, as a teacher, it certainly has imposed limitations that I have worked around. But as a scientist per se, doing research, it has basically halted to zero. Not completely, but a lot.
And that's purely based on the fact that like you can't work your machines from home.
Yeah, like if you're a different kind of physicist or scientist where you can sort of just work the numbers, right? Like if you're a theorist, or all you need is like a computer to run simulations or stuff like that.
Right.
You're definitely still able to do your research because you can run your simulations through just the internet. You can do your math in just your desk with some paper. So it definitely, and I'm sure they've had some limitations in terms of how they collaborate with other people and how they interact with other people, because definitely how we interact with collaborators has changed through COVID.
Right. And is some of that based on the fact that we're in Ecuador? We're not where these like big high tech state of the art.
Not necessarily, because even when we lived in the United States, it would have been the same thing. Like unless you're in a multi-billion-dollar lab, which there's like very few of them in the world, it's gonna be really hard, right? Like if you work at CERN, that is a $1 trillion lab.
That's Switzerland?
It's in Switzerland.
Yeah.
It's the biggest lab in the world. So if you work there, the machine, you never actually run the machine. The machine just runs itself all the time. So unless it's shut down, they turn it off and on for maintenance, but you get your data automatically.
Yeah. Sort of a constant feed.
So even though you're an experimentalist in that sense, because you're processing real data, because the machine is so expensive and it runs itself, there's no need for your involvement for the machine to function, right? Interactions with people have certainly changed it with COVID, and I'm sure there's some limitations with that. But physics in this modern age is just such a global endeavor that we already collaborated through Zoom with most people.
Right.
Because I have collaborators that are in China or in the United States. There's people have in France. Like you just naturally collaborate with people who are not with you. So we've collaborated on this environment of of Zoom calls and emails for years now. Yeah. So I'm sure it's affected some people, but I think the effect on that is minimal.
Okay.
Experimentalists that work on their own labs and they're not billion or $1 trillion facilities, I think almost all of them are going to be affected by this more than any other scientist in any field, right? Like chemists and all that. Biologists, I'm sure, have the same kind of issues.
And I guess we should add that you don't work in a lab exclusively. You work in a lab that's attached to a university that has been shut down for the past, not shut down, but online for the past year. So scientists who do work in a lab exclusively, do you have a sense of whether they're considered essential person? Like they have to keep going to their labs, right?
I think it's probably a decision on the owners of the lab. I'm sure things like big enough companies like Intel or stuff like that, they have the resources to keep operating, like to figure out how to operate even though they don't, because they can't just stop. Like you can't just stop producing computers because there's so many other industries that depend on computers. And for them, it's their business. So
it's basically up to the discretion of these lab owners.
Probably each lab has their own policy, whether they're online or they just shut down or they continue business. And it's in their best interest to keep it functioning properly, right? I believe because most labs that are of that size are private endeavors, they're probably each one could sort of regulates their own.
And I asked that as a segue into, how other scientists are dealing with this. Like we've said before, you're a professor You've had to reimagine ways of teaching physics, which is traditionally, like you said, done in a lab. It's done very hands-on. You've had to create ways to teach physics over Zoom calls. I've watched you work through some of that, and it's been really challenging just for you intellectually to like figure out how to do that. Do you have a sense of how learning physics online as a student is right now? Like, how are they affected?
I would say it affects different classes differently. Same as the same idea basically as with the research, right? Like if there's classes that are very theory focused, or you just sort of work through the numbers, those are easier. I do think there's an element of conversational teaching that happens, especially with physicists when everyone's just sort of in the same room. I do feel the main difficulty there is people can just sort of check out during a Zoom call.
Yeah.
It's harder to do
Yes.
that. It's harder to do that when you're in person, right? Like you can still check out, obviously, but it's harder, right? Like you can engage students easier in person than through Zoom calls. That said, my style of teaching I don't think has changed that much for those kind of classes. I do ask them to like keep their mics on all the time and to keep their cameras on all the time so that we can just get as close to that conversational feeling. This for the physicists. For the engineers, I just ask them to have their cameras on just so I can see them and recognize their faces when they're talking to me. But yeah, the difficulty there is some of them can just check out. I think the biggest difficulty is in, there's a class I teach which is experimental physics, which is about throwing these kids to a lab and tell them to build an experiment from scratch. And the idea of this class is very different from other classes because I feel most classes you teach them how to do something and then you test them either a homework or an exam or something, whether if they retain that content or not. It's very traditional in that sense. This class is more about, I'm just going to throw you into the water,
Right.
And you're going to mess it up, right? And the point of the class is not to get it right in the first time, but to get it right in the second or third time. It's about messing up and fixing those issues.
It's like a true troubleshooting.
It's a troubleshooting class. Yeah. And I feel this one has been extremely difficult to move to online. Initially, when COVID happened, we just straight up canceled the class.
Yeah.
We didn't know how long COVID would be, so we figured, hey, once this is done, we'll retake the class. The next semester, we retook it, and it was mostly done through simulations in the computer, but really the problem with that is the simulations always work, right?
Yeah. Right. A computer's not going to make
unless you program it to make random mistakes here and there.
Right.
And we just didn't have the time to do that, to do enough simulators to introduce errors. Mm-hmm. So, I don't think these kids particularly got a lot out of the class, more than the concepts, right? Mm-hmm. Where we're doing this semester, I'm not fully happy with, but it's better. Mm-hmm. What we did is essentially assemble a bunch of kits with electronic components that we send them to their house. Mm-hmm. And we try to figure out a way to make it as easy as possible for them to assemble all they need to assemble in their house. We didn't want to send them a kit of like $500 each because it's cost prohibitive. So we assembled about like a $50 kit, and that's what we send to the kids. And essentially what we're doing is we have this little computer card that lets you connect anything to it. Mm-hmm. And you can either output things or input things. And it's very generic, right? So then you program the card, you tell the card what it is you're sending it, and then that card can send that info to the computer. Okay. And then you program the computer. So they have to do the computer, they have to do the card, and they have to do the circuit. And it's not exactly what we were doing before, but I feel it's fairly close enough. Mm-hmm. The part that we're missing, and it's the part that I would like for them to have, but not quite, is essentially then after they assemble all this equipment, they go to the lab and hook it to a machine and measure something real, right?
Yeah.
As opposed to just building something that you never use. Mm-hmm. So right now we're better, but not quite there because they're building things that they're not using. Right. And we can't quite have a system because the machines that they need to test are expensive, so we can't just send. Hopefully, eventually we can, move back to the lab and have people use the equipment.
Yeah.
But that's the main
You were actually scheduled to have your first in-person class again.
Yes,
today?
twice now.
Last Friday or today?
Today.
But it keeps getting postponed.
So yeah, it was originally at the start of the semester.
Yeah.
The government canceled that and moved it to today.
Yeah.
And then today got canceled again. It got moved to March 5th.
Mm-hmm.
At this point, I told my students, let's just assume that we're going to be on distance, because we can't keep assuming that we're going to go back and keep getting pushed back. So let's just assume that we're never going to go back, or not never, until we're this semester, let's just assume it's going to be a Zoom semester. If we happen to go back at some point, we'll reevaluate, but let's say the default is we're just going to stay at home.
Yeah, it's hard for anybody to plan
Right.
so anything other than just like everything being online.
Yeah. So we'll hopefully get back to at some point, and they can get at least some hands-on experience measuring things with the things they are building. But at least they're building something now,
Yeah.
and that is going to come naturally with some mistakes, which is the part that is most important of the class.
Right.
It's just not knowing how to do something. How do we figure out how to do it?
Got it. I guess this is another shift, but also just thinking about still being in this pandemic. You said when you were talking about Feynman and the stereotypes of scientists that they're not great communicators. Maybe they don't know how to explain something in layman's enough terms without simplifying something. But we're living in a time where like scientists need to be very clear and specific about what they're asking the rest of the world to do to get out of this pandemic. How do you think scientists can do better about communicating, specifically when the rest of the world needs to believe scientists to overcome the pandemic?
We talked a little bit about this in the infographic you're making.
Oh yeah, hold on for that.
But the idea is, I think a lot of scientists. Let me back out a little bit. I think the first problem that society faces as a whole, that post-pandemic we should fix, is when we teach science, in an effort to get kids motivated, we tell them that it's easy. Right? Like, this is easy, you're going to get it, it's fine, don't worry about it.
Mm-hmm.
Right? When I think that's a disservice to kids, I think it's better to tell them, hey, this is going to be really hard, but you can do it. Mm-hmm. You're smart enough to do it. Right? This is going to be hard. And I think the problem of that is when you're an adult and you're presented with a scientific concept that is hard, you've conditioned your mind since you were a kid and now to an adult that it should be easy, right? So that's going to lend itself to going to the very extreme to like, oh, I don't understand why Earth would be round when I see it flat. So the simple solution is that it's just flat. So I'm just going to say it's flat. When things are just not always that easy. Things are not always how you see them. Mm-hmm. The point of physics is to remove the perspective of the scientist and find the objective truth. So whether you perceive the Earth is flat or not is irrelevant. The important part is what is true. And that truth is not always simple. Mm-hmm. So I think we're doing a disservice when we teach science when we say that science is just simple. Yeah. Right? Like,
I do want to push back on that though. And maybe it's just because we grew up in the 80s and I'm a girl, but like I think I was told a lot growing up that science was too hard for me.
I do think there's the other shape of it, the other side of it is definitely for women. They've always said that they just can't do it, right? And again, the point is not saying that it's easy or saying that it's hard. The point is saying that it's hard, but saying that people can do it.
Yeah, I feel like a lot of what people are dealing with now are these big, broad concepts of science and this pandemic that, they were either told like you should
be able to get this.
You should be able to understand this, or they've been told, oh, it's science, it's over my head. Just let the scientists deal with it, and not wanting to understand it.
Like we don't need either extreme. We don't need an extreme saying like it's easy, you should be able to do it, because that's going to cause frustration, or the other extreme where it's said like you're just incapable of doing. Right? Mm-hmm. Like we need the right middle when we say this is hard, but you can do it. Like don't be afraid of it. It's going to take work. It's going to take effort. It's going to take tears. It's going to take time. It's going to take sweat. It's going to take a lot out of you, but you can do it.
Yeah. Sort of going back to our original question, in what ways can scientists communicate better so that they are believed I mean, we went through 4 years of an administration that crapped on science and scientists. Like, how do scientists, come back from that?
I do think in an effort to simplify the things that we say, sometimes we overdo it.
Mm-hmm.
And we end up losing the essence of what's true. We've talked about this analogy before, but the discovery of the Higgs boson, this was like 4 years ago now. But before it got discovered, there was...
Can you tell me what that means?
Yeah. So essentially 3 or 4 years ago, or the Higgs boson was discovered, but people were talking about it. Like we could feel that we were close to discovering, right? Mm-hmm. So there was a lot of interest generating in the press. Peter Higgs, who's the discoverer, and other people in the media sort of referred to it as the God particle, right? And this got misconstrued as into, there's proof of God now. This is God exists now. Science, and that's not what that person meant. Right. So what did he mean? Every particle in the universe, right, can be represented with a mathematical item called a field. Right? Mm-hmm. When these fields interact, these particles become real, right? So when a bunch of fields interact together, you get an electron, right? When a bunch of other fields interact together, you get a quark and things like that. However, the theory didn't allow for mass, so we didn't know how things had mass, right? So this Higgs boson is the field of mass. So when this field interacts with all the other fields, it creates an electron, but now it has also mass because the Higgs field is involved. So it's just an interaction, and this is how we model what we see. But essentially you have this mathematical representations of things. When those interact together, something gets created. And we didn't have proof of whether the Higgs field existed or not. Until we discovered the Higgs, right? Okay. Why did this person say the God particle? Because we had these things that had no mass, and now that we discovered the Higgs boson, now we could explain why those things had mass. So in a way, discovering it made it a little bit more real, because now it had mass, which is something we know things have. But in the effort of representing it, I was like, it's something that makes things exist in how we see them in the world. He called it the God particle.
Right.
When it has really nothing to do, misrepresenting what it really means, right? What we mean is it's just another field is another representation of something that gives a property to other things. This particular thing gives the property of mass. Obviously, it got misrepresented, and that makes a disservice to how we represent science.
Yeah.
And then the other thing and I think that's in the side of how we report science, not scientists, but reporters is...
Because, I feel like a reporter would attack, like if this Higgs guy said God particle, that's what people in the media would
they
just
want the headline.
Attack that,
So I feel scientific reporters need to know that the headline is not necessarily the most important thing. And I know you want to grab readers and you're going to want to captivate them, but you don't want to mislead them, right? Obviously, in the God particle example, the fault was with the scientist, not with the reporter. He just reported the phrase that the scientist said. But there's definitely cases where we can be better, right? And I think the third side of that is we need to teach people how science gets conducted. And I feel the perfect example of this is the anti-vaxxer thing. Most anti-vaxxers say that there's one paper, scientific paper, peer-reviewed, that got approved, that said that vaccines cause autism, right? What they don't say is that paper later was retracted by the journal. The doctor who did that trial got his medical license revoked because his entire research was unethical. What essentially happened is he had financial interest in a competitor of that vaccine, so he didn't mean to say that all vaccines cause autism. He meant to say, this particular one causes autism, so go buy the one I have money in. Right. Obviously, that's an ethical complaint. And the reason why we need to teach how science gets done professionally is because science is a self-correcting mechanism. So it's impossible to always get things right and get them right.
Because you discover more.
And constantly. Get them right in the first try. Right. So you sometimes get things wrong. Sometimes you get things incomplete. Sometimes you get people who are just immoral and just game the system. And people need to know that because there's one paper that got retracted, that is not scientific proof that something happened, right? What you need to do is the body of work of that field, right? If the consensus is that pretty much every other article aside from that one says that there's no proof of vaccines causing autism, well, that's the body of work of the field. You trust the body of work of the field. And fields evolve, so things that were true 30 years ago might not be true now. Right. Or they might be true but incomplete. So I feel people need to understand that science is an ever-evolving field which has self-correcting mechanism, and you just gotta see the system as a whole rather than just one particular thing.
And that leads me, we've had the conversation about climate change, right? Where a newscaster will have someone who is a proponent of climate change, and then they'll have someone who thinks climate change is not man-made. It's just the way of the world. It's going to happen regardless what we do. And because they do that, it makes non-science people think that, oh, this is a 50-50 argument. Like half of people in science believe in climate change, and the other half don't. When in reality,
it really should be 99 against 1.
Right.
Right. That should give you the ratio. Like, are there? Of course, there's papers that say that climate change is not real, or that it's real but it's not man-made, but the vast majority of them do. Right. And the argument some people are there. Well, there's political interest telling scientists what to say on those papers. Well, there could be political interest on the other side as well. Right? So the point is you look at the global state of the field, not just one paper, or you don't pit them 1-to-1 to give them equal airtime just because you think that's fair, right? Really what you should be doing is pushing what the community of scientists in that field say that is true. But we should also teach people that science is an ever-evolving field, so things change, right? But trusting science is what has given us the modern world. Everything from your house standing to the internet to the COVID vaccine are because scientists work hard and to find new ways to do science, right? So that's why you should trust scientists. And until people realize how much work goes into science and they understand that science is difficult, there's going to keep this sense of like, I can just read that one paper or read that one article that references that one paper and trust that one but not the other.
And not only that, but like read the paper where the title reaffirms something I already believe. Yeah. Which is, I think for most people who get their news from Facebook, it's your whole feed is just reaffirming. Yeah. And I do feel this is not their fault. Like it's not the fault of the people who are necessarily anti-vaxxers or are necessarily like flat earthers or whatever. I do feel it's just the educational system has failed them to teach them properly how science is done. So they don't sort of think that, what they perceive as what's true necessarily. So that's sort of something that Neil deGrasse Tyson always says, is that really we just need to improve how we teach science. We need to modernize it. We've been teaching science the same way for 2,000 years. We just need to do better. And I do think maybe COVID is a nice opportunity to start pushing new ways to teach people in general, and new ways to sort of share what we know without oversimplifying it. Which is a great segue. My last question for you is, how do you already see or how do you hope to see the science industry or just science education changing because of COVID? Frankly, I don't know. I do know where I would like it to go. I don't know what sort of tools can be developed to do that. I do think what COVID will push is the need to change. I feel science has been very comfortable in its own skin in how we do things and has been reluctant to move on to the future. And I feel COVID has shown us that it's necessary to change. Are you talking about like the logistics of science? Not because I feel like science is always sort of cutting edge looking to the future, but like the ways in which things are actually done.
Yeah, I feel science is very cutting edge in the sense that they're literally what's pushing the knowledge. But the mechanics on how we teach. Let's just talk about the first class you get in physics. It's Newtonian physics, right? It's been taught the same way for, 800 years since Newton, or 500 years since. And because it's been taught always that, like essentially the outlook is, well, that's how I got taught, so that's how I'm going to teach it. And there's just no push for change, or there's very little push to change. So I honestly don't know what kind of thing will come up. I do think COVID has shown us there's a need to change. If nothing else, because that's how sort of science, survives the new era of digital communications, right? Like what happens when we're no longer able to attend classes in person, right? So we need to develop tools for that. How about using tools like computer? Like let's not just use pen and paper. And those have their uses and they're very valuable. But let's just use the new tools that we have.
Yeah, I mean, I remember having, when we first came back to Ecuador, you were really, really putting a lot of work into like gamifying classes and like giving kids a bit more incentive to engage in the class and in sort of trying to teach science in a new way. It's back and forth whether those students actually responded to that, because you're not gamifying classes right now. But yeah, it's responsibility on both, right? The professor and the students to like change.
I do feel my approach when I started teaching was misplaced, I guess, because what I was trying to do is changing the grading system essentially to make it more fun. I do think that's a disservice to students. I think nowadays I think the grading system is basically irrelevant mostly. What we need to change is the content, right? And not the root of the content. Physics is very precise and we have to teach what we have to teach, but it's just how to approach the content, not the grading system, what needs to be changed. So I think when I started, my approach was very different. My current approach, I guess, is to try to make it as logical approach as possible, especially for more advanced students. Try to make sure that they understand what's going on, and I'm trying to use the most digital tools as I can to make sure that, hey, this equation does this. So let's just look at an animation of that equation so you can understand what each parameter in the equation does. So it's not longer just equation that's in a board. This is how this function looks, and when you just move around a slider, right? This is how the function changes, and when that function changes in that way, the system behaves in a certain way, right? Like when you change this, your material becomes harder, or when you move this, it means it conducts better electricity, or sort of things like that. So I really do think that's where the tools are going to take us. Not so much in changing how we grade, because what I've realized is that's just irrelevant in the end of how students absorb content, right? Whether you give them 10 points or 100, they're going to absorb it the same. So we need to just better tools to show what things are. And I do think newer generations, because of technology, have become more visual. So I think that's where science has lagged behind. We have not kept up with how visual kids are nowadays. So that's where I think the update, the future of teaching science needs to go.
Okay. Well, thank you for answering all my questions.
Of course, it was a pleasure.
As we mentioned before, we worked together on a couple infographics to remind people of what the scientific method is. There's that little bit that we learned in high school about hypothesis, test your hypothesis, report results, but we made an infographic to show how the scientific method works in the real world, and it involves a lot more money, a lot more writing for grants, and a lot more review of that work getting tested and either rejected or getting published. Watch out for some merch. I'm going to put that infographic on some merch for y'all. Yeah, thank you. This was our February collaboration. We're going to keep on trucking, but it was a pleasure I dig into that brain quite a lot, but not about science. So it was nice to hear your thoughts about that stuff. No,
it was a pleasure. Thank you everyone for watching and listening, and look out for those infographics. Buy the merch.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye. Hey, hello.